Hello, everybody. As everyone joins, I'll just keep a patter. Yes, you can see me. It is the principal in my London study. I'm afraid I decided to come back to London this evening, and I'm looking forward to looking back, thinking big, how to handle a pandemic. Oxford is gradually coming to life. Only yesterday, it was extraordinary. One of the fellows came into my office, which hasn't happened, I have to say, in the last 4 months. And we both went to the King's Arms for a beer. It was really it was fantastic. Well, look, there's still plenty of people joining, so I won't kick off until we have until I can see the numbers steadying. One thing I do want to say is that I'll talk for about 25 minutes maybe. And then please ask questions through the Q&A function, and Olga from the Development Office will pick them up, and she will join me about 25 minutes in, 30 minutes in, and I'll handle all the questions. But what I'm going to do is start off with just a kind of reviewing the last 9 years. It's extraordinary. And then develop my themes about acting and thinking big, how to manage our way through the uncertainties of this pandemic. So let me kick off. I'm just going to bring, what I'm going to do is I've got some notes here. So, I mean, it's extraordinary to think. It was 9 years ago that I walked into Hertford College at 9 a.m. on September the 1st, 2011. And actually, there was no one there to greet me. I went to the porter's lodge, they directed me to my office, and there I sat. Jill Simons, the PA, brought me a cup of coffee, and there I sat for an hour and a half, 2 hours, wondering when I come to the right place, but I was at the right day. Was I really wanted? Anyway, and it's going to be strange leaving. I mean, in 4 weeks' time, 5 weeks' time, I will hand my keys to the porters, wave goodbye to an empty quad, and jump into my car and drive away. Although you won't, it's not goodbye, it's more like adieu. Just a few reflections on the last 9 years. I mean, as part of the theme of this evening, I don't think neither Hertford, plainly part of Oxford University plainly part of the university sector in the UK, and of course the UK. I mean, we all hang together in a kind of golden umbilical cord. But the Hertford I founded in 2011 was always actually an academically pretty strong institution, but it felt a bit down in its luck actually. I mean, and people were, the previous 2 or 3 years had not been particularly happy with the fellowship and the then principal. The infrastructure was creaking at the seams. Particularly, there was no, I mean, the Wi-Fi was extraordinarily imperfect. And all around the place, it could do with a lick of paint. Financially, it seemed to be run on a shoestring. It seemed very precarious. International programs, although doing well, had not really hit its beat. Donations were running, we were bottom of the collegiate league table. And in my first 100 days, I took it upon myself to meet every fellow and hear from them, what should I do with this principalship and this kind of, I'd already been interviewed, and I had an emergent agenda, but I mean, they all talked about the infrastructure, they all talked about the admissions office, they all talked about administration, the lack of it, and I got a fairly clear kind of line of sight about what to do. And actually, when I look back, and some of you may know, I co-chair a little think tank called the Personal Company. I'm a great believer in the notion that companies that are purpose, that are North Star of purpose, do better than those that don't on all metrics. And I spent a lot of my first 3, 4, 5 terms working on a purpose statement for Hertford College. Who were we? What did we want to be? And of course, it ended up with the hashtag, a commitment to academic excellence, but never forgetting our commitment to fairness. And trying to build a story about how the college, in its history, and had laid a platform for that, and that was where it wanted to go next. And I was very lucky, actually. I think in those early years, there were 3 anniversaries. There was the anniversary of the Neil Tanner scheme. There was the anniversary of being one of the first 5 colleges, male undergraduate colleges to admit women. And there was the anniversary over the building of the Hertford Bridge. And they all, in their different ways, gave opportunity for that kind of statement of who Hertford kind of was and wanted it to be, to kind of live in the celebrations we organised around those anniversaries. Some of you remember the bridge to bridge bike ride, putting up, taking down in the hall the portraits of what was incorrectly described as dead white males, with Walter Botimer. That was one of the portraits being taken down, sharply reminding us he was very much alive. And of course, our commitment to access via being the Tanner programme, which we all know. And of course, it's worth recalling that in Michaelmas term 2010, 59% of our offers were to students from state schools. And although we're very proud of our record, and that was still one of the better kind of performances in Oxford, it certainly put us in the top 10. We're no longer kind of in the top 2 or 3. And today, I have to say, Michaelmas term 2019, it's 82%. And we are very firmly kind of second in the pack, and one of the leaders actually in Oxford in making the case for admitting students from as wide a socioeconomic background as possible. And one of the themes of my principalship has been trying to support the access team and trying to signal as fiercely as we can that we're interested in. That's what we're committed in. That's what we're committed to. That is part of the Hertford DNA. I've also tried to build up, a much stronger administrative wing of the college, and I think our staff would concede. I hope they'd concede that actually Hertford in 2020, whether it's IT, whether it's the bursary, whether it's the academic office, whether it's catering, whether it's the Porter's Lodge, is just that bit better run than it was 9 years ago. Managed to open up the college to outside speakers, the Hertford Conversations, and all this laid a platform, I think, for the kind of improvement that took place in the conference programs, and you, our alumni, who've been so generous in supporting us. And we really can, over the 2020s, think about enlarging our estate, and modernizing it and enlarging it, and in particular, having a library. We have a library, of course, but having a library that's a 21st century library, in which actually has sufficient study spaces for the students who want to study in it. It is a little bit, certainly it's not like that been in Trinity term this year, but Trinity term last year, the finalists are a bit like German tourists in Ibiza. You have to be first on the beach to put your towel down. You have to be really get into the library 7 or 8 in the morning to get your study cubicle, because by 9 o'clock they're all occupied. So the hope is that we'll get planning permission to build and modernize the existing library, so that it will double the number of study spaces to 130. And all of that has, there's a due self-confidence, I think, about Hertford. And I handed on to Tom Fletcher, with some pride, and also some sense that actually I know he's an excellent man. He will actually carry through with the momentum that we have now. And I'm very optimistic. But you have to caveat it. COVID-19 has hit us. And the fact that Britain has not been good at handling COVID-19 in comparison with other European countries is noticed. It's noticed by our potential international students. And of course, there's we've left the European Union, and so that the fees for students from we no longer count the EU as home students, so they're going to have to pay international fees. That's going to deter them, and of course, a trade war is looming with China, and Oxford is as dependent on Chinese students as some of our universities, but it's 45% of the students who come through international programs are Chinese. And you look at the autumn with phenomenal uncertainty. How are our fellows going to teach? Who's going to be here? Will there be another outbreak of the pandemic? Will there be another lockdown? And that segues into kind of a larger discussion, really, that what's going to happen to our city centres? What's going to happen to the many industries, particularly in the service sector, that depend upon crowded high streets and crowded city centres, and office workers in high-rise buildings coming on public transport that's often very overcrowded? Are they going to do that? Are they going to work from home? What will give them the confidence to get on buses, trains, underground trains in London, given the high uncertainty and kind of lack of confidence that you have to have, being a spectator, as all of us have been, of the government's kind of many misstarts over the last 3 or 4 months. And that's where we can be well set as a college, and actually the university can be well set. Congratulations to the Jenner Institute and Dr. Sarah Gilbert, who become the public face of what may potentially be a vaccine that will benefit not just the UK but all humanity. I mean, what pride we can all take in that. And yet, by the same token, the Oxford city centre is deserted without the students from not only Oxford but from Oxford Brookes, the news agents, the corner stores where I go to buy the paper in the morning, they're shut, and the economy of Oxford depends not only on vibrant universities, but actually on kind of everyday consumers, everyday workers, everyday men and women having the confidence to come into the city, believing they're not going to catch COVID. And one of the uncertainties about the autumn is actually, will there be an effective testing, tracking, and an isolation regime for us in Hertford, for the university more generally, and actually nationally? So and then on top of that, there is Brexit. I mean, the point I make is the Jenner Institute and our kind of fabulous capacity to generate these vaccines is because it sits in the kind of medical division, which has been a massive beneficiary of EU membership, leading research project after research project, which is also true of MPLS. I mean, the scale of the kind of Oxford's research effort, its preeminence actually now overtaking Cambridge, has been very much built on EU membership. And of course, that and COVID kind of really hang as a profound shadow over the university and over the college. And I think many of you know my work over the last I've been 35, 40 years. And I wrote my first book on Keynes in the early 1980s, published in 85, The Revolution That Never Was. And my next book was The State We're In, which was extraordinarily the second best-selling kind of economics book of the 20th century. And that came out in 1995. But the best-selling book in the 20th century was, of course, Keynes himself, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which was published in 1920. And actually, I took a Keynesian view of where Britain stood in the middle of the 1990s, just as Keynes himself took the same view of where Britain and the world stood in the early 1920s. And he has enormously influenced my thinking. And what I feel is that systematic mistakes over the last 35, 40 years have kind of crystallized kind of in the way that this pandemic has been handled, and in the uncertainties that we confront this autumn, and in the uncertainties about what kind of economic recovery we're going to have, and the plain fact that the budget deficit is going to be £400 billion in this financial year, and frankly, not much prospect unless there's a much stronger recovery than one can expect reasonably, it coming down very fast. We are living the fact that that we've refused, I think, to look at a bunch of kind of structural difficulties and actually cultural difficulties the country has confronted since the early mid-80s. Public Health England is plainly suffered from too much centralisation, a refusal to use the many kind of local officials who had data and who had testing and tracking capacity. Even now, it's all being micromanaged from Richmond House Department of Health and Number 10. The centralisation has enfeebled it, as well as austerity. It wasn't a protected department, despite the promises that were made it would be protected. And as a result, like local government, and it suffered cumulatively a 40% real terms cut in its budget since 2011. And austerity has also comes through kind of in the kind of lack of public housing. So that the 10, 15 hotspots where we're watching a potential re-emergence of COVID are all areas where public housing is inadequate, they're overcrowded, people can't isolate, the rate of the social distancing is impossible, the densities are very heavy, and you have a Leicester effect. And that could happen in Bradford, it could happen in Stoke, it could happen in lots of small towns either side of the Pennines. And that could be the trigger for a second wave. And we refuse to build resilience into the National Health Service. The accent was efficiency, low cost, because we daren't spend, a pound of taxpayers' money was deemed to be more valuable than the resilience that might be bought by spending it on having some spare capacity kind of in the health service, whether it be intensive care units, whether it be beds or whatever. You all know the story. But when I look back, when I arrived at Hertford on September the 1st, 2011, we just had the first couple of George Osborne's extraordinary budgets. And I have to say, yes, it was true that a budget deficit of 10% of GDP, 10.5% of GDP, needed to be lowered, but 95% of the burden of lowering it was borne by public expenditure cuts of the type that Public Health England experienced, and taxes simply weren't increased. The amount of tax increases was trivial. And so in a place like Blackpool by 2016, the cumulative impact of that was to lower the so-called social wage and by £1,000 a head. no wonder Blackpool voted 65% to go to leave the European Union. The European Union got blamed for the privations of austerity and the sense that actually of the scarce numbers of jobs that were available, well-paid jobs that were available, European nationals were taking them by kind of immigrating into our country. And so the slogan, take control of our money and our borders, had tremendous resonance in so many parts of the country, as was represented by the way Labour lost all those seats in its famous Northern Wall in 2019 general election. But for me, that was because I don't really believe that the Brits are notably anxious to fall into the hands of the United States in a trade deal. I don't think that we are non-European in our value set. It's obvious that Ian Duncan Smith, the raw cheek of the man, it was Ian Duncan Smith and the European Research Group who so encouraged in 2012, 2013, David Cameron and George Osborne to reach out to China. And there was that famous trip to China in the autumn of 2013, in which George Osborne, Boris Johnson and David Cameron go around China, kind of wide-eyed and innocent, kind of trying to sign up deals, making London the centre for the renminbi trade, and that they're going to build the third and fourth nuclear power station in Britain, having partnered EDF in building Hinkley. At the time, it was the menace of China, and the willingness to allow Huawei to then build our 4G network and even to get so involved in our 5G network, was part of that was Osborne and Cameron wanting to demonstrate that Britain had other options from the European option, and the Chinese option was one to embrace. And now Ian Duncan Smith has the barefaced cheek to challenge the government into taking a harder line on China, the very same China he was urging party leaders to embrace 7 years earlier as an alternative to the European Union. So and then of course long-standing failures in our corporate governance and industrial strategies. Germany has handled this pandemic so much better than us. We have excess deaths now above the 5-year moving average of over 67,500. That's more than the cumulative civilian deaths in World War II. The excess deaths in Germany, for comparison, are around 15,000. And our death rate is 4 times higher than that in Germany, partly because they had a decentralized public health system, partly because they had spare capacity in it because they'd invested in it, but also partly because they had a much more agile so-called Mittelstand, their medium-sized enterprises who could very quickly kind of flip production from things that were manufactures and artifacts that were adjacent to medical goods, that were medical goods, so that there haven't been the same shortages of ventilators and protective equipment in Germany as there are in Britain. We simply didn't have a production sector that was capable of kind of doing the things that the Germans were able to do. And that has been a long-standing inability to have the kind of banking kind of support, the training support, the culture in which, as in Germany, it's fabulous to build an enterprise and then try and hand it on to one's children. In Britain, one of the things I've been struck by as a principal is the number of Oxford alumni who have fabulous houses in the Cotswolds from having made a lot of money from investment management, and all power to their elbow. But actually, when you get a moment like now, when you want people in the Midlands and the north of England to be able, and parts of the economy where traditionally there's been our manufacturing heartlands, to be able to quickly turn and produce the kinds of things we need to be produced to help us handle a pandemic. Even vaccines, we've got negligible in-house vaccine production capacity in the UK, and it was only chance that AstraZeneca wasn't, who was partnering up with Oxford, weren't taken over in 2014, you'll remember, when there was a big bid for them by Pfizer. Now, the post-Brexit, one would be less capable of of saying to the Americans, sorry, you can't buy one of the jewels in our pharmaceutical industry. At that time, AstraZeneca had been the result of a defensive alliance between the pharmaceutical division of the old ICI and Sweden Zeneca, and AstraZeneca was the result. It was going to exploit the possibilities in the single market and the customs union, and that was the argument by its chief executive. Could that argument be made in 2021 when giving a low exchange rate? You know, a company like an American company like Pfizer comes for one of the jewels in our crown. Where in 5 years' time will the Jenner Institute be? Will it be capable of producing in an ecosystem the kind of vaccines it can produce today? And would it be able to partner up with a UK-based pharma manufacturer to produce the consequent drug? You know, all these failures have kind of crystallized in this moment. It's why there's so much uncertainty. It's why people are worried about whether they dare to come back to work, whether it is safe. It's one of the reasons why we have an economy so fragile that the recession is the deepest here. It looks as though GDP will decline by 15% in this calendar year. That's twice the rate of GDP decline of Germany or the Nordics. And you know, the unemployment rate, even the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, thinks the unemployment rate will rise to 3.5 million. Privately, the Treasury think the figure will be 4.5 million. To get to 3.5 million, the Office of Budget Responsibility think that only 10% of the 9 million people who are currently furloughed will be made redundant. I think the figure is likely to be 25 or 30%. And my fear is that unemployment will be north of 5 million in 9 months' time, with the people between 16 and 25 being disproportionately hit. People leaving Hertford will find it tougher to get work than at any time since 1945. And this is my generation, and some of you who are listening to this webinar, who have been responsible for not making the corporate governance reforms that might have given us a strong Mittelstand, and for not having an industrial strategy that supported our production sectors, for overemphasizing financial and business services, for being far too laissez-faire in allowing over 3 million people to work in the hospitality sector, which is now so vulnerable, for not actually being prepared to pay the taxes that would have sustained a resilient public health service. And so what is the way forward? Well, here I'm optimistic. Here I'm optimistic because I do think that these truths are going to become very lived out in reality in the next 12 months. I mean, already I congratulate Rishi Sunak on his monetary and fiscal policy. He has been thinking big with his furloughing scheme. My fear is he's not going to carry on thinking big, because the Germans have a 12-month furloughing scheme. They call it the Kurzarbeit program. It's been long-standing in Germany. We are going to try to wrap ours up after a mere 7 months. And I think we should be retaining a wage subsidy across the autumn and the winter, and only withdrawing it in the spring. And I do think one has to cross these Keynesian Rubicons of actually Rubicon 1 is the government is not a household like an ordinary household. The government is not a firm like an ordinary firm. The government can borrow perpetually. It doesn't have to borrow a mortgage it repays for 25 years. It can borrow money and say that's a perpetual bond, or it can borrow money and it's a 100-year bond. It has the capacity to tax. It has the capacity at the limit to actually print money by having an overdraft with the Bank of England. It can later sterilize that money if the liquidity threatens inflation. And I do think we have to break out of the discourse in which we think of the state as a household like any other. It's not. We have to break out of the discourse that markets are self-organizing to produce best outcomes. Keynes in 1920 Will Hutton in 1995 and Will Hutton in 2020. That's not the way markets behave. They are beset with uncertainties. They are the speed of adjustment in labour markets and financial markets is just a different pace. There are multiplier effects. Markets are not a well-oiled machine. I think the best way to think of capitalism it's a kind of zoo in which wild instabilities happen, and you have to keep animal spirits going through priming and stimulating them, or contain them. You need an agile state that actually does build institutions, build resilience, superintend finance. And public and private are kind of interdependent spheres. It's been a lifelong conviction of mine. And actually, I leave Hertford believing it even more strongly than when I arrived. We have to cross the Rubicon that actually inequality is pernicious and affects us all. I remind people that in the western part of our cities, in the second part of the 19th century, the well-to-do built their mansions and because the air was fresh, and they left the working class and the lumpen proletariat to live in the east part of cities, where the fumes and the disease blew through. But ultimately, by the time you got to the end of the 19th century, it became transparent to everybody that actually clean water, sanitation, vaccination, public health was something that was such a public good that the middle class, even living in the more privileged parts of cities, could not escape from. And I think we're in that same position now in 2020. I think it's obvious to all of us. If you go to a football match, if you go to Glyndebourne, if you go to watch the rugby, if you go to a concert, if you're sitting in a restaurant or bar, you want to know that the people on the next table or on the next seat are healthy and aren't going to give you a life-threatening disease. We have a mutual need to co-invest in a resilient public health service. I think that we need a reset in the way our companies run themselves, that need to put purpose at front and foremost, rather, as I tried to do at Hertford 9 years ago. And that should be the North Star by which they steer. There's more to say maybe in the questions and answer session. And above all, I think that not to be in the single market and customs union, and to try to do, there isn't going to be a trade deal now, we know, under Donald Trump, who I think is likely to lose the next presidential election in November. And having a trade deal with China is far-fetched. So the two big trade deals that the Leave campaigners said, along with India, that we're going to compensate for the leaving the single market and customs union, simply do not exist. And to go into this degree of uncertainty that COVID is in introducing, with the institutional structure that we have, and over and above it, to leave the single market and a customs union, will, I am sure, be seen by future historians as an extraordinary act of folly. But living through the folly, as we're going to have to do over the next 2 or 3 years, is, I think, going to change us. It was Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, who said Britain's got to go through a veil of tears before it becomes what it is, a leading but medium-sized European economic and political power, which has to perforce make common cause with our neighbours in the space that we share. And it's going through the experience of the next year or 2 or 3 that will, I think, change public opinion. Already, if there was a referendum now, I think we would vote. The opinion polls, the YouGov suggests that the yes vote to remain in the European Union would be as high as 60%. Those who have campaigned for leave look very discredited. So I finish off my kind of think big, act big, how to navigate our way through a pandemic, thinking that actually there's going to be a choppy 18 months. I think the next kind of academic year is going to be difficult for Tom and the fellowship and the kind of and the student body, no question about it. but there will be a vaccine. We will actually manage our way through, even if we have to have local lockdowns. Oxford's scientific preeminence, I think, is going to become of international import. I think we will attract better and better students. Not that they weren't very good beforehand. And I also think that the debate in the country is going to be around the kinds of things I've been discussing tonight. And I think the EU is about to become pretty popular. I think having the right corporate governance and talking about a reset of capitalism is going to become kind of a common language. I think the necessity to have resilient public health systems is going to become, again, an accepted commonplace, and that's going to segue into the necessity to be green and to take environmentalism and all that goes with it fundamentally seriously. And I think that's going to be these wins are going to fill Oxford University's sails, and it's going to go forward and become even more strong than it currently is. And here's my finishing off line. I think that Hertford is brilliantly positioned to do well. A young fellowship, great traditions, a great culture, great staff, wonderful college officers. Some of the research done by our fellows are absolutely extraordinary to behold. It's been a privilege to lead the college over the last 9 years, and I know that Tom Fletcher is really looking forward to taking on the baton from me. I'm sorry I can't say anything else about the next 18 months, but I think it's the period we have to go through to think and act big in a Keynesian way. And actually, I think in the act of remaking our economy and society, actually, I think our undergraduates may find that for all the hard times in the next year or two, that actually the country that emerges will be very much stronger than the one we're currently living in. So thank you very much for bearing with me.
Thank you, Will. You have taken us on quite a journey through the last 9 years at Hertford and beyond. We've got quite a few questions, so I'll kick right off with the first question from John Clark.
Ah, John, hi.
So John's asking, given the likelihood of the COVID-19 virus being with us perhaps for years, and hence the risk of further waves of pandemic due to travel from countries lacking the resources to control the disease, isn't there a prerogative for the international academic and medical community to combat the short-sightedness as well as selfishness of Operation Warp Speed, the Trump administration's buying up all potential drugs and vaccines for America First use?
I strongly agree with that. I mean, I think that the figures in parts of Asia, notably kind of India, and some of the figures in Bangladesh aren't very bright either. Some parts of Africa and some parts of Latin America are really scary. And one of the reasons it's all very well, my talking about the willingness of British workers and consumers and citizens to use public transport and to use city centres. I mean, the same is true more internationally. We have these air bridges between European countries. And even so, the kind of density of traffic on them is still quite low. But who wants to fly or who wants to accept goods, people from these so hard-hit parts of the world? And the case for not undermining the World Health Organization, but actually strengthening it is obvious to all. And here, I mean, I'm sorry, I won't bang on about this again. Actually, I can't make that promise, I probably will. But it's one of the reasons I'm so sad about our leaving the European Union. I mean, the European Union has the capacity to buy vaccines on the kind of global scale. And wouldn't it be great if Britain was at the table making the case and doing that with our international partners, rather than having nobody covering our back at all. So I strongly agree with that point.
Thank you. We've got two similar questions about China. So how does our relationship with China need to change?
I wrote a book called The Writing on the Wall in 2008, 12 years ago. And I visited China 3 or 4 times in the act of writing that book. And I came away, I thought there's only 2 paths for what's going to happen in China. One is that actually they do keep Deng Xiaoping's promise and create some kind of democracy with Chinese characteristics, or it will go totalitarian, authoritarian, as the party asserts its control, particularly as it's confronting a legitimization crisis. And I was pessimistic. I thought that the most likely outcome would be the latter, and so it's proved. I think I said in my talk, I think to allow Huawei, I mean, the millions of lines of code in Huawei infrastructure, the capacity to kind of insert the 2 or 3 lines of code you need to be able to kind of blow up our communication system if tensions ever grew with China is formidable. And it was a category error ever to allow them this degree of proximity. It is a one-party state. The Communist Party is hell-bent on its control. Every enterprise in China, even those that are in the so-called private sector, have Marx said that enterprises with more than 8 people were structurally exploitative. And so the Chinese Communist Party from Mao onward has said all enterprises of more than 8 are structurally exploitative. And the only way to temper that is to have a Communist Party committee overseeing the board. Every enterprise in China has a Communist Party committee overseeing its board, and Huawei is one of them. And so, you know, they're all party to extending the power of the Chinese state. And the Chinese state, I mean, the pictures of that drone, of those Uyghurs being blindfolded as they move from train to train, was so evocative of, you know, trains carrying, Nazi trains carrying Jews in the 1930s. It was painful. And what's happening in Hong Kong is, I mean, the treaty that was signed by Chris Patton, and I was there actually in 1997, I think it was, when we handed over Hong Kong. It was a 50-year treaty, and it was going to be 1 country, 2 systems, and they're going to respect that. The Chinese have overturned that by introducing these new anti-terrorism laws in Hong Kong. We we the West, have to take a strong line. I'm delighted that Dominic Raab is doing that. I'm delighted that the Labour Party is backing them. I'm delighted that, I mean, the open question is whether the Germans will follow suit given the immense exports they have and trade relationships they have with China. But I mean, the only thing to do with the Chinese is to stand up to them cordially. But here's a problem for us. I mean, you know, a lot of Chinese students come to Oxford, in fact, come through Hertford, and you know, they're good people. I mean, and actually, you simultaneously want to be as robust about values that we stand for and are not going to compromise on, as well as actually welcoming them into our education structures, where actually the best of them, you hope, will pick up, you know, why Western values are universal values and why they should be re-imported into China. So I'm afraid I'm on this one. I'm really quite hawkish. I'm sorry about that.
Thank you, Will. Moving on to the UK industry, we have a question from Nick Keith. What do you think about jobs and new machine tech and traditional engineering and manufacturing?
Well, I think I do think that one of the interesting phenomena of our times is kind of micro production. You know, Gale's bakery has kind of micro ovens in every Gale. making very lovely bread, I think. Microbreweries. You can't go to a pub in Oxford without being offered one of the kind of brews from the microbrewery. Micro fashion houses. I mean, there is a kind of one of the things that the Internet of Things has opened up in modern communications is the capacity to have decentralized micro production, extraordinarily low cost. And one of the great things about manufacturing production is it doesn't have to cluster in quite the same way as business services do, or financial services do, or the creative industries do. You know, you can have manufacturing sites doing these kind of micro forms of production in the kind of business parks and industrial parks around our kind of second tier towns and cities. I also think that and I've been very impressed by what the kind of Eindhoven effect in Holland, where Philips and the University of Eindhoven and the got together to form a kind of growth pole in Eindhoven, which has been reproduced in miniature in Lincoln, where the newly established Lincoln University has used its university status to create an expertise in offshore engineering and robotics and underwater kind of engineering, which Siemens has capitalized on by bringing in a factory which employs 3,000 people to supply the North Sea. So, you know, we have to think, I think, in how, you know, universities can be kind of growth poles. I mean, look at Oxford itself. I mean, and what's happening at Harwell, spinning out of I'm on the board of the Space Catapult based in Harwell, and you know, the facilities that are being built up and the small firms that are kind of spinning out of that as kind of is wonderful to see. So, you know, the combination of kind of micro production, some elements of production of foundational goods that we cannot do without, you know, food, for example, drink, clothes, and new economy jobs around university clusters is where I think one can build a production economy over the next 10 or 20 years. But it does need structures to support it. It does need, you know, long-term venture capitalists. It does need decentralized banks. It does need a capacity to train our young. So that level 3, level 4 skills are much more widely available than they are now.
Thank you. We have quite a few questions about taxation and tax system, so I might read them. I might read them out together, and you can combine your response. So there's a question from Meredith. How can the tax system be repurposed to demonstrate that it is an investment in resilience and our future rather than theft? And then there is a question from Jeremy Dawkins is asking, over the last 10 years, income levels have remained constant or fallen, whilst capital values have gone up by more than 100%. Do you favor a wealth tax? And I think a question from the same series is, sorry, just a moment, is from Mike Shields. A whole generation, or maybe two, has been successfully convinced that taxation is an inherent evil, and somehow we can pay for public services without tax increases. How can this be turned around without making political parties unelectable?
Three great questions, and maybe we can form a subcommittee with those three questions. I'll try. I'll do my best at trying to answer them. I mean, I think that one of the I've always claimed, and for all his weaknesses as a politician, Tony Blair was a brilliant marshaller of argument, very persuasive, and actually an old friend of mine says, you know, you can always judge a great politician if she can walk into a room and there's 50 people and they divide, you know, half and half in her favour, and when she leaves the room, a majority are she's persuaded a majority of them that she's got right on her side, and that argument, together with lived experience, is really, I think, the only way you can change people. After all, it was the lived experience of 39-45 war that laid the popular foundations of the Attlee settlement. So I think living through this pandemic and seeing that you do need a resilient health service, and you need resilient social care sector, and that essential workers take fundamental risks that need rewarding. I think it has to be paid for, and I think it has opened up that argument in a way that should be capitalized upon by quality politicians making the argument. And you're right. The third question. I mean, it's seen as confiscation, it's seen as theft, it's seen making them unelectable. But of course, one of the reasons why that argument is difficult to mount in Britain is because of the power of the right-wing press. And again, newspaper circulation in the last 20 years has more than halved. So that, a newspaper like the Daily Express, which used to sell, when I was editing the Observer back in the mid-90s, the Express sold 1.5, well, I think it sold nearly 2 million copies. It now sells 500,000. Similarly, the Sunday Times, when I was editing the Observer, was selling over 2 million copies. It now sells 400,000. These are really big fallaways, and their influence on the public conversation is much less than it used to be. And there are other channels through which one can make arguments. So I'm optimistic that lived experience and the power of argument will begin to move the debate. Do I favour a wealth tax? I do favour taxes on wealth, but I think we have two. One is called capital gains tax, and one is called inheritance tax. And I would be, and I noticed with interest that Rishi Sunak is calling for a review of capital gains tax, which I'm sure will lead to an increase in the rates. And inheritance tax, I think, again, I think it's far too easy to escape inheritance tax by trusts and offshore kind of offshore holdings, anonymizing holdings. I remember, and 25 years ago, my then wife, she sadly died 4 years ago, Jane, we got into our head that we're going to convert a barn on some land my family has owned for a long time into a barn you could live in. And the local builder, who has been actually doing work for us for years and years and years, asked us, who we should invoice. And we said, well, you invoice us, obviously. And he then said, this is 25 years ago, he said, you are the only client that I invoice who is not offshore or hasn't got some offshore company that I invoice. And you had this kind of vision of, the whole of North Oxford, where this building company works, and one of the things I had to do was to, in order to, when my great aunt died, we had to pay the inheritance tax, and I was proud to pay it, and I had to sell some land to Blenheim Palace. They were the only buyer, but I didn't sell it to Blenheim Palace. I sold it to a Liechtenstein trust, and this has to be, this has been long-standing, and the capacity of the very wealthy, not to pay, not to shoulder their fair share of the tax burden, simply must be addressed. And interestingly, it may be a Conservative Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, who begins this process with the review of capital gains tax.
Thank you, Will. The next question is from Chris Fisher. I used to work in the civil service on risk assessment and management in food. And what is clear in this, as in all other human activity, that safety doesn't exist. So is the challenge with COVID not to accept and learn how to manage the risk rather than expect to eliminate it, even in the medium term?
Now, again, I mean, everyone knows I'm critical of Boris Johnson and co. And I think their handling of I used to work with Boris actually. I was economics editor of the Guardian. He was the Europe editor of the Daily Telegraph. We used to cover summits together, and he was as much fun to be around and as extraordinarily untrustworthy as he is as Prime Minister. But I on this, I do think you can't have you can't have 9 million people indefinitely being furloughed. You can extend the wage subsidy for 12 months from 7 months, but you certainly can't extend it for 24 months. And at some stage, people have to start taking risks and imagine that there's kind of no risk out there, and that life can be risk-free, is, I think, and pernicious. I mean, if there's we are going to have to live with a degree of risk, and I think that will become more acceptable actually when we become more confident that if you get COVID, it doesn't mean it's not a death sentence. I think some of the recent developments in drugs, that part of the reason why especially for older and fatter people, and I'm old and fat, the difficulty is that you get a lot of mucus, and you literally drown in your own mucus. And the big point is to prevent the mucus from developing and actually drowning your lungs. And there seems to be some increasingly good progress on that, so that one doesn't end up in intensive care. If COVID starts to be seen as bloody awful, but fatal only in a tiny minority of cases, I think it will start to build up confidence. But of course, confidence is also about. If you were certain that there was a secure pair of hands kind of at the wheel of the state, that actually that the test and tracking system did work, that we were not only doing our best to, that actually at every stage of the crisis, the government had got it more or less right, and had fessed up very quickly and honestly to mistakes being made. I think that would have been confidence inducing. But I do agree with that, and I do agree that Johnson's been right and the cabinet's been right to try and bring people back to work in August. I think that's been a right move.
Thank you. The next question is from Stephen Hubbard. Does Facebook represent a threat to liberal democracies and therefore need to be regulated?
Facebook does represent a threat to liberal democracies. It's sad that a man I knew well, Nick Clegg, has decided he wants to be the public face of that not being the case. I mean, Facebook would say that it's intending to regulate itself. I mean, actually, the former Prime Minister of Denmark, actually the master of Lady Margaret Hall, Alan Rusbridger, are all sitting on a advisory committee set up by Facebook to make sure that it takes its obligations to being a content producer and not just pipes through which content flows more seriously. And Alan tells me, that he certainly is going to take it seriously. So Facebook does, in a sense, kind of acknowledge there's an issue. But the way in which Facebook was used by the Russians to influence the 2016 presidential election, documented by Robert Mueller. I don't think we'd read the Mueller report, but it's damn scary. And I'm sure that something similar was done in the UK for Brexit. I think, in fact, the Mueller report makes more references to Russian interference in the British election than actually the Intelligence and Security Committee's report does, because it was unable to get any information from either the Home Office, the DCMS, or the security services. I mean, it really is extraordinary that we've been so asleep to the threat of manipulating opinion on social media. And we need social media to be regulated by the same framework of libel law, and that actually the analog media is regulated. Facebook has made some strides, but I'm not confident that it has made sufficient strides. And it's a very, very, very profitable enterprise. It could certainly afford what it complains would be tens of thousands of people screening content. Facebook, you can afford it. What is the amount of usage worldwide? It's north of 3 billion, isn't it? There's 8 billion people on the planet, I think, and there's 3 billion Facebook users. I mean, that is extraordinary.
Thank you. We have another technology-related question from Barry Levy. Are you concerned about the impact of artificial intelligence on the employment market and on a macro level internationally?
Gosh, these are good questions, actually. The old principal is reeling if I try to kind of answer these well. I am influenced here by one of our, well, Mike Waldridge, who gave one of the earlier Hertford Responds. I mean, Mike is his Road to Conscious Machines is a great book, and on the FG summer reading list. And I kind of go with my AI kind of, and also the Big Innovation Centre, which I'm associated with, is the secretary of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Artificial Intelligence. So via that, I've been getting across the debates. I mean, it's obvious that AI in the wrong hands is a force for bad. Especially in chemical warfare, or making judgments on battlefields, or even making judgments about, being behind the wheel of a bus, in tight situations. How do you, or behind the wheel, in a cockpit of a plane? I mean, when you have, these life and death decisions to take about, landing in areas or crashing in areas which minimize kind of multiplier deaths, AI has yet to be as robust as it needs to be. But on the other hand, AI enhances possibilities. I mean, AI, the robotic-driven cars through sensors, the capacity to use satellite networks to plot where the world's shipping is, lowering insurance rates thereby. It's kind of, I mean, I'm on balance. I mean, my view is that AI will kind of generate jobs rather than lose them. I mean, Zoom that we're using for this call uses kind of AI algorithms to produce this extraordinary capacity we have, and actually Zoom is creating itself a new industry of kind of audio-visual conferencing and all that goes with it, audio-visual teaching, and et cetera, et cetera. I do think there will be, however, transitional costs, and I do think it's true that what is routinizable in manufacturing and in the service sector will be turned over to AI. So lawyers, conveyancing, why can't we have standard contracts driven by AI? Why do we have to have, why does the whole rigmarole of having a kind of checking land registry manually with a solicitor have to be gone through? Why can't we do this kind of with AI? Auditing, so many areas of business and financial life, I think, will be turned over to AI. But I mean, human wants are infinite. Human wants are infinite, and AI will help us to see better, help us hear better, help us read better, help us enjoy life better, and that will itself produce new demands and new industries. Keynes wrote a letter to his grandchildren in 1930 as the slump was breaking over, saying in 1970, he said, there'll be full employment and every house will have a car and we'll have a radio and we'll have a vacuum cleaner. And living standards will be twice as high as they are in 1930. And he was regarded as a fool and a knave. One more reason to distrust Keynesian economics. Well, he was wrong. Living standards went up by 3 times, not by twice. And actually, it was many more household goods than those that became commonplace. I take the same view with AI. You can, in 30 years' time, when I'm dead and buried, pushing up daisies, you can quote this back to me, but I'm sure that living standards will be higher in 2050 than they are now, and I'm sure there'll be lots of work to go around. But transitionally, it's going to be bumpy.
Thank you, Will. To conclude the conversation about the world issues, and before we talk a little bit about Hertford and your personal journey, there is a good question from our fellow Pat Roach.
Hi, Pat. The man I had a beer with yesterday. Yeah.
To make progress in these big issues, which are deeply structural, we need to have somewhere to discuss them. Unfortunately, the normal channels, including much of the print media, the BBC, and even Parliament, are rather muzzled, while the government majority gives them free rein. So how do these get raised and discussed in the depth and seriousness they need?
Pat, how dare you ask such a difficult question? Look, I'm in close touch with the Observer and the Guardian, newspapers which you may have noticed have just had to announce 140 job losses, and the Mirror Group are losing work, losing people, and so is the Sunday Times, so is the BBC. I mean, the orthodox media channels are all being hollowed out. Advertising revenues, Daily Mail plunged by 45% in the last 6 months, and they're going to have to take some reduce their staffing. So, we just the orthodox media is not healthy, and the social media is in these terrible silos where you either we shout at each other, or you just stay in the silo and are comforted by people thinking the same thing that you're thinking. And I do think public debate is the weaker for it. But Pat, I think my answer is, I do think that I ultimately am an optimist, and the human spirit comes through. And actually, and I do believe in enlightenment values, as you know. And I think one way or another, we will find a class of politicians who will find a language that speaks to people. I'll give you an example. 6 weeks ago, I wrote a column in the Observer arguing for a national youth corps, as a kind of Rooseveltian kind of initiative that would employ 16 to 25-year-olds and give them the minimum, everyone give them the minimum wage. When I wrote it, I was regarded as a complete nitwit, but Chancellor Sunak has kind of borrowed my idea with the Kickstart program, only 6 months, not 12 months on the minimum wage. And I'm now I'm trying to put pressure on the government to actually still keep going with a national youth corps, but to call it the National Civic Service, rebranded as the National Civic Service. And we're launching a social movement, which I'm working with a group of young people, and they wanted to call it the Ohana Movement, OHANA. And I said, Ohana, what the hell are you talking about? And they said, well, it's used in Hawaii and Fiji. It's a South Sea Island phrase that South Sea Islanders use to kind of bring everyone. No one must get left behind. Your family is not just your kin, but it's your neighborhood and your extended network, and they must all come with you. And so the combination of the Ohana movement, a letter in the House of Commons signed by 70 MPs, well-argued pressure in back channels, is actually, we'll see. But I think the public conversation on this, we may get some movement. So I think one has to be optimistic about a combination of the old and new, and that good argument and lived experience, to come back to my theme, changes minds. So that's the best I could do, Pat. You could tease me when I see you.
Thank you. To continue about the idea of the public debate, there's a question from Graham Wynyard. How reassuring is it possible to be about the robustness of open academic freedom of debate in the light of the growing non-platforming and cancel culture apparently pervading our universities, including Oxford?
Well, I mean, I've been principal for 9 years, and I can tell you that successive presidents of the JCR and MCR take as tough a line as I do on no platforming and on the cancel culture. I mean, it's not actually part of the Hertford DNA. And I do think, I mean, one's going to be slightly wary about this. I do think that the political right, I mean, you know, the old arguments were about political correctness and mocking political correctness. I think there's enormous exaggeration in how far this goes. So that's the first thing to say. And you know, the Hertford societies that, you know, I mean, simply don't. I mean, they want the debate. The Oxford Union wants the debate. And I think in a university like ours, actually, I mean, whether it be the Chancellor, whether it be, you know, it's Chris Patton, whether it's Louise Richardson, whether it's the heads of house, whether it's the individual JCRs and MCRs, whether it's the Oxford Student Union, I mean, we are pretty much kind of shoulder to shoulder on the importance of academic freedom, as every fellow in every college is. It's a fundamental tenet of actually what we stand for as universities. That said, you know, I mean, the cancel culture was a way of hitting back at the kind of the Rhodes Must Go campaign, and you know, Oriel's decision to bring down its statue of Rhodes, and of course what happened in Bristol with the toppling of Colston. And I mean, I've moved myself on this. I mean, I thought, in writing 5 or 6 years ago, that actually one had to stand by these things. They were part of our past. They should be respected, and as long as they were contextualized, it was fine. Actually, in the end, Oriel couldn't find words to contextualize the Rhodes statue, and that was a big shortcoming, which left them wide open to what happened. But I've changed my mind a bit. I do think that, you know, erecting a statue is a political act, and one can, you know, constantly find ways of kind of thinking about our past in different and renewing ways. So I mean, I'm not a cancel culture man. I'm not going to go that far. But I actually slightly decolonizing our literature and decolonizing our history up to a point. I'm much more interested in I'm much more interested in actually renewing, making statements about what we believe in now, contextualizing what was in the past, recognizing it needed to be contextualized, and kind of reinventing oneself. I think in the same way, when I'm now 70, and I'm, you know, I look at my life, you know, the way I think about myself as a 15-year-old or 25-year-old is different, you know, now I'm 70, to the way I thought about it when I was 40. I mean, it was Sartre who said, you know, you constantly think about your own, you're constantly reinventing oneself and rethinking oneself and making sense of oneself. And I think that's true of a nation and its history and its culture. So, I mean, I wouldn't, so I've got some sympathy for those who say, let's take down our statues and or contextualize our statues, and let's build new ones. I mean, open question: should we at Hertford build a statue to Alan Locke? He was the first Afro-American Rhodes Scholar. Came here in 1907 and really enjoyed Hertford. Although we didn't give him a degree actually. And that would be. We actually have a picture of him in our hall, and delighted that we did that. And I think it's an important, way of actually saying, come on, we are a college, and this is, all part of who we are and what we are, and we want to foreground, and unlock a bit more than we have done. So, no, let's not cancel culture. Let's live our culture. Let's breathe our culture, and let's reinvent it, as we progress and as we reappraise it. Sorry about that. A cough. That's not a COVID cough. That's just me speaking. I'm hoarse.
Thank you, Will. We have quite a few questions left and not that much time, unfortunately. So
I'll be very quick. I'm going to be ultra quick.
We'll make sure we will email answers to all the questions
Right,
which don't get asked as well. So I don't think it will be possible to ask them all. But just to finish off talking about Hertford a little bit, what is the thing you will miss most about Hertford?
The camaraderie, the sense of being part of a community. I mean, many of the people on the line are alumni, and I really have grown very fond of. I mean, beyond fond. I love the place. I love Hertford. I love what it stands for. I love its nooks and crannies. I even love, ridiculously, every morning I have to, as I go into my study, I have to walk past the Bishop of Newfoundland and the Bishop of Mauritius, who are Hertford. Why quite they have to command that degree of space at the bottom of the staircase in the lodgings is a bit beyond me, but I'll take that with the Works of Art Committee. But I mean, I love the place. I love that. I love the banter, lunches and dinners. There isn't an alumni I've met who hasn't, in one way or another, taught me something I didn't know otherwise. So it has been a pleasure to be around. And it's become my life. It's being a principal of an Oxford college is of course, it's a job, but it's also a lifestyle. It's 24/7. It never, I'm always checking my emails. I'm always checking my handset on my mobile, and it's never stops. There's no holiday. But I've never minded somehow. It's not, I don't feel it's an intrusion. I feel it's my life. So, on August the 31st, I kind of cut my hand off in a way. I leave a part of me right behind. I can't see anything else than that. I mean, it's also beautiful, I mean, working and living somewhere beautiful. My office, I look out on the Radcliffe camera, and it changes its color as the day wears on, it's never the same. And it changes its color, it changes its shape and sense of itself over the seasons. I go running in Christchurch Meadow. I go running in University Park. I played tennis this morning. I have to say, sorry, it was on a tennis court, Merton's tennis court, actually, just behind our boathouse. Cycle there. What a pleasure is that? Come on, I'm going to miss it. I'm going to miss it a lot.
Final question, Will, from Mark. What is next for you personally?
What's next for me personally? Well, I'm a lucky guy. My wife died 4 years ago, and I've met someone who I'm very, very fond of, and that's going to be a big part of my life going forward. But I mean, and professionally, I want to work at and try and make as much noise about the things I care about, and I've talked about them this evening. I will carry on co-chairing the personal company and trying to make the case for more companies living the corporate governance code. We managed to get that the Financial Reporting Council, to insist in the new corporate governance code that every company in Britain, even private companies, should state their purpose in their report and accounts and live it and report on it regularly. And I'm very proud of that, and I want to carry on doing that. I hope that I can make a bit of a difference for 16 to 25-year-olds in this National Youth Corps or this National Civic Service. And I hope I can make a difference I hope I'm can make a little bit of a difference to the European cause in Britain. I mean, I care about it a lot. I know it seems utterly forlorn and hopeless now, but when Goldsmith launched the referendum party in 1993, that seemed hopeless. I think it may be quicker before we get a second referendum to get us back in the European Union. So those are three things I want to do professionally. I'm joining the LSE, Centre for Economic Performance. I've got an economics book I want to write. So that's going to occupy me professionally. But in my personal life, I'm going to enjoy some little house I'm building in Woodstock. I'm going to enjoy the new woman in my life. I'm going to enjoy my grandchildren. And I'm going to enjoy playing bridge. I'm going to enjoy drinking wine. I'm going to enjoy stopping and taking the time to stop and stare. I'm going to cycle. I'm going to walk. I'm going to bicycle. I'm going to try and serve less double faults. There you are. That's what I'm going to try to do. You'll find me at the odd guest night, I'm sure. I'll let a year or two pass before I do that. But I tend to be I tend to come back to the college I love.
Thank you, Will.
So, Will, I just wanted to come on at the end of this just to say thank you so much. Firstly, thank you to everyone who's attended. I should introduce myself. I'm Frances. I'm the new Development Director. I joined in February. But really what I wanted to say was thank you to Will. I've really enjoyed listening to your talk tonight. I've really enjoyed getting to know you over the last 5 months, and it's a real source of sadness for me that that's all I will get working with you. It feels like a real shame. But you mentioned that what you would miss about Hertford is the sense of camaraderie and the sense of community, and I just wanted to acknowledge that that is a huge part down to you, and I think everyone on this call would agree with that. If we were all together in person, then we would be asking you to raise a glass now to toast Will and congratulate him and wish him well on the way. So I will raise a glass. It's just ginger beer, I should add.
Raise a glass to you.
Well, we will really miss you, Will, and thank you for everything that you've done, and we're so pleased that you won't be going far and that you'll be coming back very frequently. So that is what I wanted to say. So
I'm going to give Tom space. I'm not going to. I mean, you know, the new principal he doesn't want, you know, the old fart hanging around. So I'll give Tom lots of space. Don't worry, I'm not going to.
All right. We'll give you a year and then we'll invite you back. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us tonight. And thank you for your support of Hertford Responds over the last few weeks. We've really enjoyed putting this together for you, and watch the space for more events in the coming months.
Thank you all for bearing with me. It's a great privilege to be able to speak. I'm a bit hoarse actually, so I'm going to, but it's a great privilege, and thank you for listening. And you know, I know many of you, and it's, you know, good times lie ahead. Come on, it'll be a choppy 18 months, 2 years, but good times lie beyond that.
Indeed. All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Good night.